The night air inside Harlem's Cotton Club was thick with cigarette smoke and expensive perfume when Dutch Schultz made the decision that would cost him 8 men and his entire Harlem empire. It was September 16th, 1935, a Monday evening when the club's tables were crowded with over 200 guests. The jazz band was in full swing, and illegal liquor flowed as freely as conversation. Among the well-dressed crowd of white socialites, politicians, gangsters, and celebrities sat Ellsworth Bumpy Jonson at a corner table, quietly sipping bourbon and observing the room with the calculated stillness that defined his presence. What happened next would send shockwaves through New York's criminal underworld for generations. Dutch Schultz rose from his prime table near the stage, his face crimson with alcohol and mounting fury, and marched across the polished floor toward Jonson's table with such aggressive intent that conversation stopped mid-sentence, and the band's rhythm faltered. Schultz's bodyguards rushed to follow him as the entire Cotton Club turned to witness what was clearly about to become a confrontation. When Schultz reached Jonson's table, he didn't sit down or lower his voice. Instead, he brought his palm crashing down on the table with such force that Jonson's glass jumped and bourbon splashed across the white tablecloth. And then Schultz began shouting loud enough for every person in that packed nightclub to hear every venomous word. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? What Dutch Schultz shouted that night at Bumpy Jonson was so racist, so deliberately humiliating, so calculated to demonstrate white superiority over a black gangster, that even in 1935 Harlem, where racial tensions ran high and segregation was the norm, witnesses were shocked by the naked hatred in Schultz's words. He called Jonson boy, told him he had nerve showing his face in the club, said that running policy banks in what Schultz called Negro Town didn't make Jonson a real gangster, claimed he'd been trying to be reasonable with you people and give the coloreds a chance to work for him, but that they were all too stupid to understand when someone was doing them a favor. The insults poured out of Schultz in a torrent of contempt while 200 people watched in stunned silence, while the band had completely stopped playing, while even Schultz's own associates looked uncomfortable at the public spectacle their boss was creating. Bumpy Jonson sat motionless through the entire tirade. He didn't stand up to confront Schultz physically. He didn't reach for the .45 caliber pistol everyone knew he carried. He didn't raise his voice or show any visible reaction to the racial slurs being hurled at him in front of hundreds of witnesses. Jonson simply sat there with an expression so blank, so devoid of emotion, that several people later described it as more frightening than any display of anger could have been, and he waited patiently for Schultz to finish talking. The silence that filled the Cotton Club after Schultz stopped shouting was absolute and terrible. Patrons at nearby tables stared in horrified fascination at this public degradation of a man who was supposed to be one of Harlem's most dangerous operators, but who was sitting there absorbing abuse without fighting back, without defending himself, without doing anything except looking up at the white gangster screaming insults at him. Then Bumpy Jonson spoke, and his voice was so quiet that people had to lean forward to hear him, so calm that it seemed completely disconnected from the fury Schultz had just displayed, so cold that multiple witnesses would later say it was the most terrifying sound they'd ever heard because it contained no anger, no heat, just an absolute certainty that made it sound like a death sentence being pronounced by a judge. Jonson told Schultz he had 7 days to remove every one of his people from Harlem, that after 1 week, any white man Jonson found running policy operations in his neighborhood would die, that Schultz was welcome to insult him in public and call him names in front of all these people if that's what Schultz wanted, but that choices always have consequences, and the consequence of publicly disrespecting Bumpy Jonson was that Schultz's people would start dying, not getting arrested or beaten, but dead, and that Schultz had exactly 7 days to use wisely. Dutch Schultz's response was to throw his head back and laugh, a genuine roaring laugh that filled the silent nightclub, the laugh of a man who found the entire situation absurd and hilarious. Schultz bellowed that Jonson was giving him 7 days, asked if everyone had heard that, said this nobody from the streets thinks he can threaten Dutch Schultz, called it the funniest thing he'd heard all week. Schultz turned to address the entire crowd like an actor playing to an audience, making sure everyone heard him mock Jonson's threat, making sure everyone understood that he viewed the ultimatum as a joke. Then Schultz turned back to Jonson and told him that in 7 days, Jonson would either be working for Schultz or he'd be dead, that those were the only 2 options, that there was no third possibility where Jonson somehow won because, as Schultz put it, Negroes don't win against white men, that's just how the world works, and if Jonson was too stupid to understand that basic fact, then Schultz would teach him the hard way. Jonson didn't reply to any of this. He simply finished the bourbon that remained in his glass, stood up slowly and deliberately, and walked toward the Cotton Club's exit. The crowd parted around him like he was contaminated, like proximity to him was now dangerous after Dutch Schultz had publicly marked him for destruction. Jonson walked past Schultz without a glance, walked past Schultz's bodyguards who tensed but didn't stop him, walked out into the Harlem night, and vanished into the darkness of the streets. Schultz watched Jonson leave while still chuckling and shaking his head at what he saw as the absurdity of a black gangster threatening him. Schultz returned to his table, ordered fresh drinks, and spent the rest of the evening retelling the story to anyone who would listen, describing how he'd put that uppity colored boy in his place, how Jonson had just sat there and taken it like all Negroes do when white men remind them who's really in charge, how Harlem would be completely under Schultz's control within a month because the last serious resistance had just been crushed in front of 200 witnesses. Dutch Schultz went asleep that Monday night believing he'd won a decisive victory, believing he'd publicly humiliated his last significant opponent in Harlem, believing the conflict was essentially finished. Less than 7 hours later, the first corpse was discovered in a garbage can behind a warehouse, and Dutch Schultz began to understand that Bumpy Jonson had not been bluffing. To understand what unfolded over the next 7 days, to comprehend how 8 men died with such systematic precision that it would fundamentally alter New York's criminal power structure for the next century, you need to understand what was going through Bumpy Jonson's mind as he walked out of the Cotton Club that Monday night. Jonson had not been surprised by Schultz's behavior or his racist language. Jonson had known for months that Schultz viewed black gangsters with contempt, that Schultz considered colored operators to be inferior criminals who existed only with white permission, that Schultz believed taking over Harlem would be as simple as showing up with enough money and firepower to overwhelm local resistance. Jonson had been observing Schultz's Harlem campaign for 18 months, had watched Schultz force Madame Stephanie St. Clair into retirement, had seen him drive Casper Holstein out of the policy business, had witnessed him systematically destroy every other significant black operator through a combination of bribes, threats, and violence that was brutally effective, because most of Harlem's gangsters simply lacked the resources to fight back against Schultz's overwhelming advantages in money, political connections, and armed men. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? But Jonson had also been watching Schultz make critical mistakes, strategic errors that revealed fundamental misunderstandings about how power actually functioned in Harlem, about what made black gangsters dangerous, about the difference between controlling territory through fear versus maintaining long-term control through community support and organizational competence. Schultz's primary mistake was assuming that violence alone would be sufficient to control Harlem permanently. He'd brought guns and money, and the advantages that came with being white in 1935 America, but he hadn't brought understanding or respect. Schultz didn't comprehend that Harlem's policy operations functioned because of community trust, because local people believed that the operators, despite being criminals, were at least Harlem people who understood the neighborhood and had some investment in maintaining the community rather than just extracting money from it. Schultz's collectors were outsiders, white men who came into Harlem solely to take money and who treated residents with obvious contempt, and that created resentment that Schultz either didn't notice or didn't care about because he assumed fear would be enough. Schultz's second mistake was conducting his takeover through visible public violence that attracted attention and created martyrs. Every time Schultz killed a black policy operator, that operator's family and associates became enemies who might cooperate with anyone opposing Schultz. Every time Schultz beat up runners who didn't cooperate, those runners spread stories throughout the neighborhood about Schultz's cruelty, turning public opinion against him even as his operations expanded and his profits grew. But Schultz's biggest mistake, the fatal error that would ultimately cost him 8 men and his entire Harlem operation, was what he did that Monday night at the Cotton Club. By screaming racist slurs at Jonson in front of 200 witnesses, by making the conflict personal rather than business, by turning what could have been a straightforward territorial dispute into a public referendum on whether white gangsters could openly disrespect black gangsters without consequences, Schultz had given Jonson something invaluable. He'd given Jonson moral authority in the eyes of Harlem's community. As Jonson walked through Harlem streets after leaving the Cotton Club, heading toward his apartment on West 139th Street, his mind was already working through the implications and formulating a response that would be so decisive, so brutal, so effective that it would establish principles about race and respect and power that would govern New York's criminal underworld for decades to come. The response Jonson conceived during that walk had 3 essential components. First, complete operational silence. Jonson would vanish from public view immediately, would temporarily close his policy banks, would stop conducting any visible business, would disappear so thoroughly that Schultz's men couldn't locate him to retaliate. This would serve 2 purposes simultaneously. It would protect Jonson from the inevitable counterattack Schultz would launch, and it would create the impression that Jonson had been frightened into hiding by Schultz's public threat, which would make Schultz complacent and careless about security. Second, systematic elimination of Schultz's key Harlem operators. Jonson wouldn't attack Schultz directly because that would be both difficult. Schultz was too well protected, and counterproductive. Killing Schultz would trigger massive retaliation from Schultz's organization and from other white gangsters who would view it as colored criminals overstepping acceptable boundaries. Instead, Jonson would kill the 8 men who actually ran Schultz's Harlem operations on the ground, the collectors who picked up money from runners, the enforcers who intimidated people who didn't cooperate, the policy bank operators who processed bets and maintained records. Kill those 8 men, kill them brutally enough to send a message, kill them publicly enough that everyone would know it was happening, kill them with notes that made absolutely clear why they were dying, and Schultz's entire Harlem operation would collapse without Jonson having to fight Schultz's full organization directly. Third, send a message that would outlast this immediate conflict and establish principles for the future. This couldn't be just about driving Schultz out of Harlem in 1935. This had to be about establishing a principle that would govern future interactions between white and black gangsters for generations. The principle that disrespecting black criminals, that using racist language casually, that assuming white superiority gave you license to treat colored gangsters with contempt, all of that would carry severe and fatal consequences. The message had to be clear enough that future white gangsters would think very carefully before calling a black gangster a slur in public, would understand that racial respect wasn't optional but was instead a matter of survival in New York's criminal underworld. Jonson reached his apartment at approximately 1:30 in the morning on Tuesday. He didn't sleep. Instead, he spent the next 4 hours meeting with his most trusted associates, men who'd worked with him for years, who'd proven their loyalty repeatedly, who would follow orders without asking unnecessary questions, and who would keep secrets even under extreme pressure or torture. Jonson gave these men a list containing 8 names, 8 of Schultz's key Harlem operators, the men who actually made Schultz's operation function on a day-to-day basis, the collectors and enforcers and policy bank managers whose deaths would cripple Schultz's Harlem interests, without requiring an impossible frontal assault on Schultz's full organization with all its resources and connections. Jonson's instructions to his men were extremely precise. These 8 men die over the next 7 days, 1 per day in the order listed. Kill them however you want, but make absolutely sure each death is discovered quickly, and make absolutely sure each body has a note that counts down how many deaths remain. Start with Vincent Colucci tomorrow night, Tuesday. He's a collector who operates in central Harlem, finishes his rounds around 11 at night. Take him after his last pickup, torture him somewhere private so he understands exactly why he's dying, then leave the body where it'll be found Tuesday morning with a note that says 1 down, 7 to go, leave Harlem. Then wait exactly 24 hours and take the next one on the list. Keep going methodically until all 8 are dead or until Schultz pulls completely out of Harlem. One of Jonson's men asked the obvious question. Bump, if we kill 8 of Schultz's people, he's going to come after us with everything he's got. He's going to try to kill you, kill all of us, burn down Harlem if that's what it takes. How do we survive that kind of response? Jonson smiled, a cold smile that never reached his eyes. Schultz can't kill what he can't find, Jonson said. Starting tomorrow, I'm disappearing completely. You all keep your heads down, operate through intermediaries. Don't do anything that draws attention except killing Schultz's people 1 per day. Schultz will be looking for me everywhere, looking for you, asking questions all over Harlem, trying to find us so he can retaliate. But everybody in Harlem saw what Schultz did tonight at the Cotton Club. Everybody heard him call me those names, saw him humiliate me in public using racist language. You think anybody in Harlem is going to help Schultz find us after that? You think people are going to cooperate with the white man who came into our neighborhood calling us slurs and telling us we're too stupid to run our own operations? Schultz made this personal when he could have kept it business. He made it about race and respect. And that means Harlem will protect us because killing Schultz's people isn't just criminal business anymore. It's payback for every insult, every slur, every time white gangsters have treated us like we're nothing. We've got 7 days to kill 8 men. After that, Schultz either withdraws completely from Harlem or we keep killing his people 1 per day until he does. It's that simple. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? By 5:30 Tuesday morning, Jonson's team had finalized every detail of the plan. Each of the 8 targets had been assigned to specific killers who had the skills and temperament for the work. Surveillance had been arranged to track each target's movements and identify when they'd be most vulnerable to attack. Equipment had been gathered, weapons and cars and safe houses where torture could be conducted without neighbors hearing screams or calling police. Everything was ready to begin. At 6 o'clock Tuesday morning, Bumpy Jonson walked out of his apartment carrying a small suitcase, climbed into a car driven by one of his most trusted associates, and vanished completely from public view. For the next 7 days, nobody outside Jonson's inner circle would see him or know his location. Dutch Schultz would spend the entire week searching desperately for Jonson, would offer substantial money for information about his whereabouts, would threaten and intimidate people throughout Harlem trying to find the man who'd promised to kill his operators. But Jonson had become invisible, present only in the systematic executions of Schultz's men, but impossible to locate for the people trying to find him and kill him. At 6:23 Tuesday morning, less than 5 hours after Jonson had given the kill order, Vincent Colucci's corpse was discovered stuffed inside a metal garbage can behind a warehouse on West 145th Street. Vincent Clutch Colucci, 38 years old, had been one of Schultz's most effective policy collectors in central Harlem for 18 months. He was known for being tough and reliable, had beaten several runners who tried to skim money, was generally considered one of the key people making Schultz's Harlem takeover successful. Colucci had finished his Monday night collections around 11, had accumulated roughly $4,000 in cash and hundreds of betting slips, was supposed to deliver everything to Schultz's main policy bank before going home. Colucci never made that delivery. At approximately 11:15 Monday night, while Schultz was still at the Cotton Club bragging to his associates about how he'd humiliated Bumpy Jonson, 3 of Jonson's men intercepted Colucci's car on a quiet side street, forced him off the road at gunpoint before he could react, dragged him from the vehicle while he was still trying to reach for his own weapon. They drove Colucci to an abandoned warehouse on West 147th Street, a building Jonson's organization controlled, a place where the walls were thick enough that screams wouldn't carry to neighboring buildings. What happened in that warehouse over the next several hours was designed not merely to kill Colucci, but to send a message through his corpse about what happened to people who worked for Dutch Schultz in Harlem after Schultz had publicly disrespected Bumpy Jonson. They began with Colucci's hands, used a heavy hammer to systematically break every finger one by one, crushing bones slowly while Colucci screamed and begged, and tried to explain that he was just doing his job, that he had nothing personal against Jonson, that he was sorry about whatever Schultz had said at the Cotton Club. But Jonson's men weren't interested in apologies or explanations. They worked methodically and patiently, breaking each finger individually, making absolutely sure Colucci felt every impact, making absolutely sure he understood that this pain was the direct consequence of working for a man who'd called their boss racial slurs in front of 200 people. Then they moved to his face, beat him with fists and small wooden clubs, breaking his nose and jaw, knocking out teeth, closing both eyes with swelling, making sure that when the body was eventually found, it would be immediately obvious that Colucci had suffered extensively before dying. Between the beatings, they asked him questions. You know why this is happening to you, Vincent? You know what your boss did last night? He disrespected our people, called us names that no man should call another man, treated us like we're nothing. And you work for him. You collect money for him. You help him take over our neighborhood, so you pay the price for his mistakes. That's how this works. Colucci tried desperately to bargain. He offered to quit working for Schultz immediately, offered to provide them with detailed information about Schultz's operations and vulnerabilities, offered money and cooperation, and anything else he could think of that might make them stop the torture. But the men torturing him weren't interested in bargaining or information. This wasn't about getting intelligence or making deals. This was about killing Colucci in a way that would terrify the other 7 people on Jonson's list, that would send an unmistakable message to Schultz about the cost of disrespecting black gangsters in public. After the hands and face, they used an ice pick, stabbed Colucci 11 times in non-lethal areas, shoulders and thighs and abdomen, wounds that caused tremendous pain without immediately killing, wounds that made Colucci scream until his voice gave out and he could only make small whimpering sounds. They took their time with this phase, spacing the stab wounds out over perhaps an hour, making absolutely sure Colucci experienced every second of suffering, making sure he understood this was punishment, not just execution. Finally, when Colucci was barely conscious from pain and blood loss and exhaustion, they cut his throat using a large knife to slice through muscle and cartilage and windpipe, cutting so deeply that the blade scraped against vertebrae, nearly severing Colucci's head from his body. The throat wound was the last thing Colucci experienced before death, the sensation of his blood pouring out, the inability to breathe, the knowledge that he was finally being allowed to die after hours of torture. They stuffed Colucci's body into the large metal garbage can, drove it to the alley behind the warehouse on West 145th Street, where they knew it would be discovered during morning sanitation rounds, and before leaving, they pinned a note to Colucci's blood-soaked shirt using a straight pin. The note was written in block letters with pencil on ordinary paper, the kind of note that couldn't be traced to any specific person or location. 1 down, 7 to go. Leave Harlem now. At 6:23 Tuesday morning, sanitation worker James Robertson found the can, opened it to see why it was so unusually heavy, discovered Colucci's mangled corpse inside, and immediately began shouting for help while stumbling backward from the overwhelming smell of blood and death. Police arrived within minutes, pulled Colucci's body from the garbage can, saw the extent of the horrific injuries, read the note pinned to his shirt, and immediately understood they were looking at the beginning of a gang war rather than an isolated murder. The note's message was absolutely clear. 7 more people were going to die, one by one, until someone, presumably Dutch Schultz, left Harlem as ordered by whoever had killed Colucci. By 9 Tuesday morning, word had spread throughout New York's entire criminal underworld that Vincent Colucci was dead, that he'd been tortured for hours before being killed, that a note had promised 7 more deaths were coming in the next 6 days. Dutch Schultz heard the news while eating breakfast at his Bronx headquarters, initially dismissed it as probably unrelated to the Cotton Club confrontation, but then learned about the note's specific message, and suddenly understood that Bumpy Jonson had actually meant exactly what he'd said, that the 7-day deadline wasn't empty posturing or bluffing, but was a literal promise that Schultz's Harlem operators would start dying 1 per day. Schultz's immediate reaction was entirely predictable: rage, threats, orders to find Jonson immediately and kill him before he could kill anyone else. But Jonson had disappeared completely. His apartment was empty. His policy banks were all closed. Nobody knew where he was or could provide any information about his location. Schultz spent all day Tuesday offering substantial money for information, sending men throughout Harlem to ask questions and make threats, intimidating people who claimed not to know anything about Jonson's whereabouts. But Harlem's community, still furious about Monday night's public humiliation at the Cotton Club, refused to cooperate with Schultz. Nobody would help the white gangster who'd called their people racial slurs find the black gangster who was killing his men in retaliation for that disrespect. Wednesday morning, September 18th, Dutch Schultz found an envelope that had been slipped under the door of his Bronx headquarters sometime during the night. Inside was a note written in the same block letters as the note found on Colucci's body. 1 down, 7 to go. Your collector is dead because you disrespected us publicly. The next one dies today. Pull out of Harlem completely or keep counting bodies. Your choice. At 2:15 Wednesday afternoon, Raymond Red Sullivan's body was discovered in an abandoned building on Lenox Avenue, shot once in the back of the head execution style. His 2 bodyguards, who'd been assigned to protect him immediately after Colucci's death, were found nearby, both shot multiple times in what appeared to be a brief gunfight they'd lost decisively. The note pinned to Sullivan's body said simply, 2 down, 6 to go. Thursday morning brought another envelope at Schultz's headquarters. 2 down, 6 to go. Every day you stay in Harlem, another one of your people dies. How many bodies will it take before you understand? Leave now before more die. At 9:40 Wednesday night, technically early Thursday morning, Thomas Little Tommy Brennan was found dead in his apartment, stabbed 17 times with an ice pick, killed in the same methodical torture style that had characterized Colucci's death. The note said 3 down, 5 to go, last chance to leave before 5 more die. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? By Thursday afternoon, Dutch Schultz was no longer dismissive or confident about the situation. He was genuinely frightened in a way he'd never experienced before in his entire criminal career. 3 of his key Harlem operators were dead in just 3 days, killed with precision that suggested careful planning and capability that Schultz had completely failed to anticipate. And the notes kept arriving at his headquarters, kept counting down the remaining deaths, kept reminding him that 5 more executions were promised unless he withdrew completely from Harlem immediately. Thursday evening brought another envelope. 3 down, 5 to go. The next one dies tomorrow, then 4 more after that unless you pull out of Harlem today and nobody else has to die. Your choice to make. Schultz called an emergency meeting with his top lieutenants, ordered them to find Jonson regardless of cost, to kill him and everyone associated with him, to burn down all of Harlem if necessary, but to stop these systematic executions before more men died. But finding Jonson remained completely impossible no matter how much money Schultz offered or how many threats he made. And Schultz's remaining Harlem operators were absolutely terrified, understanding clearly that 5 of them were still on the kill list, that 5 more bodies were coming unless Schultz gave up Harlem entirely and immediately. Friday brought 2 more deaths in rapid succession. Anthony Little Tony Benedetto was beaten to death in an alley behind a restaurant. Joseph Joey Numbers Catalana was shot in the face inside a crowded restaurant, while dozens of witnesses watched 2 black men calmly walk in, execute him at his table, and walk out before anyone could react or stop them. The note said 5 down, 3 to go, and 6 down, 2 to go, leave now or die. Friday evening brought another envelope at Schultz's headquarters, this one containing a message that was longer and more explicit than the previous notes, spelling out exactly why these killings were happening and what Schultz needed to do to stop them. 6 down, 2 to go. You want to know why your people are dying? Because you disrespected us in public. You came into our neighborhood, called us racial slurs, told us we're too stupid to run our own operations, treated us like we're nothing because of our skin color. You thought being white made you superior and gave you the right to insult us. You thought we'd just accept your insults and submit like good Negroes. You were completely wrong about that. Get out of Harlem immediately. Never come back. And don't ever disrespect black men again unless you want more of your people to die. This is your last warning. The final 2 executions happened over the weekend. Saturday morning, Harold Bunny Weinstein, one of Schultz's top lieutenants who'd been directly coordinating the entire Harlem operation, was found shot in the back of the head in his car on West 47th Street in Midtown Manhattan, killed in broad daylight in one of the busiest parts of the city. The note said 7 down, 1 to go, your weekend comes tomorrow. Dutch Schultz spent all day Saturday in a state of near panic, barricaded inside his Bronx headquarters, surrounded by armed bodyguards, sending urgent messages to his one remaining Harlem operator Patrick O'Brien, telling him to go into hiding immediately, to survive Sunday, to prove that Jonson's threats weren't inevitable and couldn't be carried out perfectly. O'Brien spent Sunday in a safe house in the Bronx, protected by 4 heavily armed guards who'd been told their only job was keeping O'Brien alive for 24 hours. But at 8:47 Sunday evening, a woman knocked on the safe house door claiming to have the wrong apartment address. When one of the guards opened the door to redirect her, she threw a gasoline bomb inside. The apartment erupted in flames instantly. The guards ran for the back exit and were immediately cut down by shotgun fire from men who'd been waiting in the alley specifically for that response. O'Brien tried desperately to escape through a window but was shot before he could climb through, his body falling back into the burning apartment. When firefighters finally extinguished the blaze and recovered O'Brien's badly burned corpse, they found a note that was partially burned but still legible. 8 down, 0 to go. Harlem belongs to Harlem. Don't ever disrespect black men again. Leave and never come back. Monday morning, September 23rd, Dutch Schultz received his final message from Bumpy Jonson. 8 of your men are dead. They died because you made a choice to disrespect me in public, to call me racial slurs in front of hundreds of people, to treat colored gangsters like we're inferior to white criminals. You thought I was bluffing when I said your people would die. You laughed at me. You called me a stupid Negro who didn't understand how the real criminal world works. I wasn't bluffing at all. Your 8 dead men prove that conclusively. You have 24 hours to close every single operation you have in Harlem. After that deadline, I start killing your people everywhere. Not just Harlem, but Bronx, Brooklyn, Manhattan. One per day until you're completely out of our neighborhood. This isn't about money or territory anymore. This is about respect. This is about teaching you and every other white gangster in New York that you can't disrespect black men without paying a severe price. That price is 8 bodies so far. It'll be many more if you don't leave immediately. Get out. Stay out. And remember what it cost you when you forgot that colored gangsters deserve the same respect you demand for yourself. By Tuesday evening, every single one of Dutch Schultz's Harlem operations had been shut down completely. He'd pulled all his people out, abandoned 18 months of work and substantial financial investment, retreated entirely from Harlem, rather than continue losing men to an opponent who demonstrated both the capability and the absolute will to kill indefinitely, until Schultz withdrew. The story spread rapidly throughout New York's entire criminal underworld, retold in every speakeasy and policy bank and mob social club across the city. Dutch Schultz had publicly humiliated Bumpy Jonson at the Cotton Club, had called him racist names in front of 200 witnesses, and within exactly 7 days as promised, 8 of Schultz's men were dead, and Schultz had been driven completely out of Harlem by a black gangster who'd proven that public disrespect carried fatal consequences. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The lesson from those 7 days lasted not just years, but multiple generations. White gangsters who dealt with black operators after 1935 were extremely careful about language, careful about displays of contempt, careful about assuming racial superiority, gave them license to treat colored criminals as inferiors. Because everyone remembered what happened to Dutch Schultz when he forgot that respect flows in all directions regardless of race. When he assumed being white meant he could say anything to anyone without facing severe consequences. Bumpy Jonson emerged from hiding on Tuesday, September 24th, walking casually down Lenox Avenue like he'd never been gone, like nothing unusual had happened. When newspaper reporters asked him about the 8 murders that had terrorized Schultz's organization, Jonson's response was simple and direct. "I don't know what you're talking about specifically, but I'll say this much. Harlem protects its own people. Anybody who comes here disrespecting our community, calling us names, treating us like we're nothing, they learn very quickly that choices have consequences." Dutch Schultz made his choice Monday night at the Cotton Club. He chose to disrespect me in public using racist language, and he paid for that choice with 8 of his people dying. That's just how it works in this world. You disrespect black men, you pay the price. Remember that simple lesson, and you'll live a lot longer. Dutch Schultz never returned to Harlem after that week. 1 month later, on October 23, 1935, Schultz himself was killed in Newark, New Jersey, by hitmen sent by other white gangsters who decided he was too reckless, too dangerous, too likely to bring unwanted attention to all of them. Bumpy Jonson took over all of Schultz's former operations in Harlem, built them into a criminal empire that would last for decades, and became a legend not just because he'd driven out Dutch Schultz, but because he'd established a principle that would govern criminal interactions for the next century. Don't ever disrespect black men, not in public, not in private, not if you all want to keep breathing. 8 bodies in 7 days. A message written in blood that New York's underworld never forgot and never stopped respecting.